I want to welcome all of you to the Center for Applied Theology's 15th session of the Foundation Year program. This one is on Francis Bacon, following on last week's when we discussed Luther and Calvin and the Reformation. And with us to lead us is Professor Alan Hall. We're grateful for his presence with us, but I'm going to hand it over to Father David Harris to introduce him slightly more formally. David.
Thank you, Father James. I only met Professor Hall about 2 months ago, but he came highly recommended. We hoped this term to have one lecturer give us 3 or 4 or 5 of the lectures, so there's a kind of continuity between them. And I asked a friend of mine who he might recommend to do that. And the first name that came to his mind was Professor Alan Hall, who is from St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. So he's going to be our jack of all trades and an oracle of all wisdom, if he's comfortable with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Excellent. Let's jump right into this Bacon, because my mind is still a little bit blown. I spent the day reading the New Atlantis.
Yeah.
So my question to you, there's so many things that just kind of jumped out at me. But the one thing that seems apparent is that there is this kind of, I wouldn't say it's a new kind of confidence, but almost a kind of new kind of worldly confidence that emerges out of this text, that the flavor of which we didn't even see in Pico or Luther and Calvin, a kind of looking toward the world with this, absolute sense that we know what's going on and that we're on some kind of a mission.
Yeah.
Introduce us to Bacon and the text that he made so important and the work that he made so important.
Oh, I think you're very right about that in many ways. I mean, the New Atlantis, part of the reason I wanted to send it to you is that it's so deeply peculiar. On the one hand, it's just a weird text. I mean, it's probably worth mentioning it. I'm just going to blab away here. Please, everyone, ask me questions, or a very strong sense that there are going to be things that are known to people who I can see and can't see right now that are unknown to me. So I really would appreciate all of the sort of dialogue that I can get. But it's worth, I think, mentioning that the New Atlantis itself was not something he published in his life. So it was found in his papers and published afterwards. And it's a very peculiar, I mean, I don't need to tell you guys this, anyone who's read it, it's a very peculiar little text. And I think there's a number of things about it that sort of strike me. The first is, I think it's actually quite a complex little text. Though the form it takes, this sort of travel narrative, utopia kind of account, is actually, it's a Renaissance trope. Like, it's a way that's not, it's something that, it's a way of writing that is quite popular. I mean, this one that he has written seems to me to be quite explicitly in response to Thomas More's Utopia, right? And he even mentions More's Utopia at one point. But the things about it, Father, and you mentioned this, that are so striking is that this new Atlantis that he discovers has the same sort of geographical relationship to the New World that the Atlantis had to the ancient world, right? So I think that's intentional. I think obviously intentional. And so he's doing something very peculiar, I think, at a sort of almost a mythic level there, where he's absolutely making the world his sort of setting, right? It's the whole world now. but he's also sinking this knowledge that is available to the people, that is made available to this narrator in the New Atlantis before the Greeks, which I think is very intentional. It's almost as if he's doing this sort of two things. He's sort of doing an end run around the Greeks, I think, historically. And by the Greeks, I mean Plato to Aristotle. I think Aristotle's the real sort of person who wants to run around there, but around Plato and Aristotle and the Greeks on the one hand, and on the other hand, he's giving us this account of a kind of pure Edenic, even knowledge that was brought to this new Atlantis, right, mysteriously in this arc, that then they sort of hang on to in a way that's unblemished, remains pure, uncorrupted, right? That they hang on to until this new voyager, who now has the whole world available to him, right, comes and is sort of given this knowledge in a kind of ritualized way. Absolutely. So I think all of those things are quite deliberate in Bacon. I think your point about the worldliness is very significant. I mean, and I think this, I've been listening in the past little bit, which has been wonderful for me. It seems to me so, but it seems to me worth saying, right, that at this, just if we're thinking sort of historically, Bacon sits after these two sort of enormous events that are related. So many enormous events. Obviously, the Reformation. He's sort of unthinkable without the Reformation, obviously, but also the scientific revolution, which is extraordinary, sort of catastrophic in some ways, fascinating in all kinds of ways. And also, you know, the so-called discovery of the New World. I mean, now, of course, it was not a discovery of a new world. However, the language around it was, that is, we have discovered a new world. There's sort of a world of wonders and miracles. So I find it very striking that, and precisely, I mean, I think your word confidence is exactly right, that he would feel that he could, on the one, that this newness sort of seems to saturate into this text, right? But that also, it seems that in this place, the New Atlantis, he finds a kind of ancient wisdom that he now wants to bring back to England. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Yeah. Now, I mean, I could keep going about the New Atlantis. I wonder if there's any response to that, but or any questions.
Maybe I set things too quickly on the trajectory of the New Atlantis. How does Bacon emerge? It seems so different than the text that we've read so far. Yeah. How does he emerge into the scene?
My own old scholarly training was in the history of science. This is why I moved to the University of Toronto, or moved to Toronto. History and philosophy of science, and in those circles, you often, I mean, this is changing, but you often learn about Bacon as a, oh, thank God, someone started thinking reasonably, right? This is sort of how he's presented, which isn't very helpful in all sorts of ways, and maybe not entirely true. I think Bacon, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that he comes after a series of very striking and perplexing discoveries about the natural world, which seem to throw a number of things into doubt. And this is sort of potted history I'm giving you, but I think it's quite significant. You obviously get, you get the Copernicus and Kepler, and then I think most significantly Galileo. and Galileo overlaps with Bacon, and he would have been aware of that. So that's happening, I think, on the one hand. And those, that work throws the, and I think this is a real thing. This is very simplistic, but there's something I think that's true about this. It throws what we might call the received view, particularly geocentrism, although Bacon was in fact a geocentrist. He thought that that was right, but it throws these things into a kind of, it makes them problems, I would put it that way. So there's a great deal of flux there. He also comes out of, and this is a very peculiar tradition, and one I don't know a huge amount about, but and a certain amount of work has been done about this in the 20th century, and it's quite compelling. He comes out of this sort of hermetic magical tradition. Pico was part of that tradition, Giordano Bruno. And that tradition was very, it was a secret tradition. It was hermetic, it was sort of esoteric. And it was very concerned with, alchemy was one of the things it was concerned with, but what it ended up being concerned with was sort of discovering what they called the hidden powers of nature. So now we would just think of this as scientific work, right? Like looking at like chemistry in particular, magnetism was electricity. These were all sorts of, there was a kind of fascination around these sort of hidden powers of nature, as they were called, or magical powers, that Bacon calls them that sometimes too. And Bacon himself is well-versed in this tradition, but I think for a series of reasons, and I think those have to do with his sense, probably, I don't know, but it seems that these have to do partly with his sort of reformed, his mother is a Calvinist, he kind of reformed sense, he's got a kind of reformist sense there. And also his sort of notion of service, right? He's got this sort of notion of, well, he is a highly placed servant of the state, right? That this tradition needs to be made public. Can you guys hear that? I'm so sorry. I think my children have been locked out of the house and are ringing the bell like frantically. I am really sorry. Maybe if someone could, I'm going to see if they solve their problem. I just want to say, so I think that. So
Professor, do you need to go deal with your children?
Yeah,
go deal with your children. I can't believe you need to be prompted for that.
Look, those are all things, this sort of making public of this experimental hermetic tradition is there. That I think accounts for this sort of weird, sudden springing into light of it, if I can put it that way. But again, this sort of coming together of all of these things in him, there does seem to be something quite new about it, and quite different, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Dan?
So following on from that, the other text that we were asked to read was the Great Instauration, of which part of which is the Novum Organum, which is I guess the text where he develops these ideas of science that you brought up. So I wonder if you could tell us about that text. Tell us about what was the method that was prominent that he's trying to sort of move on from, and what's the new scientific method that he's proposing within this text.
I think, you hear me here? So hi. The door is now unlocked. There you go. Okay. I think So what he's very explicitly doing, and you will all have captured this, caught this, I think, or read this in the text, is he's addressing, I think, Daniel, I think part of the problem is with Bacon, there is something sort of like manifesto-like about this text. So it can be hard to separate there's a manifesto quality to it. So it's not, I don't take his report on the sort of the Aristotelian schoolmen who he wants to do in to be totally fair, right? Like it does seem to be that he wants to sort of, he's being quite polemical. But what he does do is he comes up with this method of discovery. Now, I think it's very important that his sort of polemical argument depends on partly on his argument that, look, that the ancients and medieval world, like there's something very self-conscious about him sort of trying to distance himself from that, a kind of overcoming of that, right? It's very sort of explicit. So what he wants to do is argue that the method, the Aristotelian sort of scholastic method is how he puts it, that's animated training and logic is fruitless, is how he puts it, right? It's non-productive. And what he wants to do is develop a method, a so-called scientific method, this is what we call it now, that would render discovery possible. Right, so this is, his concern is to come up with a kind of method that would allow us to learn new things about the world. So now, it seems to me that this, you guys, there is really something quite profound going on here, I think. And part of it is this, and he rejects this quite explicitly. He says, you know, knowledge of ends. So for Aristotle, as you guys may well know, and this is sort of handed down, and I think really quite manifest in, I mean, it starts to creak in Occam in really fascinating ways, which is why I'm so glad you guys included Occam. But in Dante, you see it sort of made beautifully manifest that this language of ends, right, of that for the sake of which our purpose is the sort of that is what it is to know something for Aristotle, very explicitly, right? To know its telos, its purpose, is what it is to know. That's the most, that knowledge of that cause is the sort of fullest form of knowledge of something. And Bacon, in a certain sense, just rejects that out of hand. And he says, look, ends are what we want to do with things. He just says that. He just said, like, explicitly, ends are human purposes. So let's not, ends is not for Bacon a contemplative moment at all. Right? Which is an astonishingly profound change, it seems to me, to remove that from the realm of as a kind of moment in an explanation. So what he then does is he replaces all of those, we've got 4 Aristotelian causes. He really says 3 of them, one of them is impossible to know and actually is just whatever humans choose to do with it. This is huge. Then he takes the efficient cause, right, and the material cause and says, those really don't tell you very much. The real thing we need to know is the form, what it is. But he actually changes, so he uses the language of form, and this is right, he uses the language of form, which we would recognize, you know, from the ancient world, from the medieval world, as meaning a particular kind of thing. And he transforms it and says, it's the form that we seek to understand in nature, right? That's what we're after, the form of things. But his starting presumption is, and this is, I think here you can see the sort of effects of the scientific revolution. And I think, you know, all these sorts, he says, look, like, we don't know what those are. Those are not apparent to us through our senses in a kind of immediate way, right? And because of that, this is where he comes up with this thing of like, we actually need to sort of interrogate nature in order to learn what things are. And so the example he uses in the New Organon is heat. He's like, what is heat? Well, now, I mean, in a sense, that isn't even really a question. I mean, it's an interesting question in sort of the medieval world, but they don't go about thinking about it in the same way at all, right? I sort of think of it as reduced to an element. And really what he does here is he takes all of the natural kinds, the natural entities that would have sort of made sense of the world for those late medieval thinkers, and just says those things, those are meaningless utterances, right? We actually don't know what heat is. So we talk about heat as if we know what it is. We don't know what it is. And so what he says, now what we need to do is come up with a method of discovery. This is induction, right? A method of discovery. And he has this system of tables, of comparing like entities where we find heat and then entities where we don't find heat, and sort of canceling them out and looking for patterns and this kind of thing. He says this method of discovery, of uncovering what these things actually are, their form is, as he puts it, this will give us a kind of basis for investigation, right, into things. So this is, in the simplest possible way, induction's held up to be different than deduction. Deduction, in the simplest possible way, is just moving from first principles down to particulars. Induction is just moving from particulars up, right? But that he inherits from the medieval schoolmen. He doesn't make up induction. But he sort of revolutionizes induction and says, look, what we need to do is use this as a tool for discovery, not just a register of observation. And so that's kind of what that's what he lays out in the New Organon. Yeah.
Professor Peter Collins, I think, appropriately asks on the chat, how much of Bacon's thinking that you're talking about right now, because of perhaps of his mother's Calvinism, is kind of a post-Reformation rejection of what was regarded as a kind of Catholic or maybe medieval scholasticism? Like, how much is that explicit in his mind?
So much. Yeah, so much, I think. I mean, I think there's people here listening. I mean, some of you would have a much better understanding of the theological movement that takes place in Bacon's life. It is, I think, explicitly about a rejection of Catholicism. And I think often you get that in these in this sort of in this empirical tradition that Bacon is sort of inaugurating in a lot of ways, which in character is very English. It's sort of English invention in a lot of ways. To my mind, it's almost impossible to separate it's just explicit anti-Catholicism from its emphasis on, I mean, the language is very polemical, right? It's sort of rejection of what it calls superstition, of the miraculous, right? Miracles, all these sorts of things. And more deeply than this, look, there is a explicit rejection, but also a methodological rejection, which is to say, the possibility of this is that methodologically, it now becomes, in a sense, impossible to tell a story like Dante tells us in the Divine Comedy. Because that mediation of the natural world, that understanding the natural world in terms of signs and forms that can point us toward the divine, is actually kind of, I think, no, I don't think, like it seems to me clear that this is cut off at its knees, right? For a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is for Bacon, you treat the natural world. I mean, he uses this it's quite weird language, right? You treat it, I mean, he was trained as a lawyer. You treat it as a kind of unwilling witness on a witness stand, right? You need to sort of squeeze it, he says, to get its secrets out of it. So this, and the reason you do that, is because you want to put it to use. He says, for the sort of, for the advantage, to the advantage of mankind, right? This is ultimately his sort of aim, his purpose. But what it means is that it seems to me, and maybe speaking in too broad steps, but this really does seem to me that nature itself ceases to become the object of contemplation, and particularly an object of contemplation that might set you in a kind of relationship with the divine. You assume the divine, right? Yeah. So it in that sense is a radical, I think, is a radical movement away from that synthesis, that medieval synthesis that you would have seen in Dante and Thomas Aquinas and all of that. Like it's very, I mean, I think it's quite it's explicit. I think it's conscious and intentional, and I think it is it has become extraordinarily influential. Yeah. Yeah.
Before we move on, just to look back at Occam.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Well, is it worth, because this is such a radical shift to come out of the blue, where this vision, this medieval vision, just sort of dies. And
yeah,
what was Occam's place in that?
Oh, I wish I could answer you more profoundly. I mean, I think, I mean, these are very, you know, as was said here, it's a very, these late medieval thinkers are so very subtle. I mean, I think it seems, it doesn't look, Father, I mean, I think, what do I want to say? I'm going to try to, I think medieval nominalism, or I think in Occam, and I goodness, would like to know more about Occam, but I think that this notion of undecidability, I mean, it seems to me Occam opens the way in some interesting ways for it to be possible to think like Galileo, which is to say that to think that there is a kind of, that we may be in a kind of relative motion ourselves, that the earth might be moving or not, and we can't really know, right, one way or the other. I mean, it seems to me this is a kind of astonishing and radical departure. Even Galileo's there. Well, very much Galileo's there. So that's maybe a very schematic thing I would say. The other thing I would say is that I think it's very important in Bacon that and again, these are themes that I think are worth people who would maybe know more than the fine-grained sort of nature of this history is not known to me, but it seems to me his Protestantism is exceptionally important here, because he is at pains everywhere to kind of give an explanation, give a theological grounding to what's happening, right? That there's that very curious argument, and I mean at the beginning of the new Organon, where he says, you know, it's mankind's fallenness came from his desire to understand moral things, right? But the knowledge of Adam, he talks about the knowledge of Adam, if he says that actually is what scientific knowledge is, right? That's knowledge before the corruption of man, kind of, right? So, you know, what we're aiming for here, and he picks up that same theme in the New Atlantis, what we're aiming for here is a kind of Edenic knowledge, a knowledge before the fall. And he really seems to think, it's just so extraordinary. He really does seem to think that that knowledge is available to us in this kind of innocent scientific endeavor that he's describing. But then what's so interesting, and so it's so weird, and it actually makes you think that there's something more complex going on, is that then he will turn it around and, you know, say, oh, we should put a statue up for the guy who invented gunpowder, right? So that there does seem to be this sense that this knowledge, this Edenic knowledge, this pure knowledge, this knowledge that was not the cause of man's fall, right? Adam's knowledge. This then we can put to our particular sort of political and social ends, right? And that will be fine and good and right. Like that is actually what is required of us. Yeah.
It was kind of amusing how in the New Atlantis, at every point that he wanted to make a gesture of goodwill, the narrator just wanted to offer guns.
Yeah.
Pistolets, right? Here, take some pistolets.
Yeah.
You must want these guns.
That's right.
Lucy, you have a question. And Father Lars has a question that might be answered by Lucy's question, but if it's not, Lars, you jump in.
Okay. So he opens up the preface to the Great Instauration, talking about the necessity of developing this new method of investigation, which is going to allow the mind to exercise, I'm quoting here, over the nature of things, the authority which properly belongs to it.
Yeah.
So does he then, can we then infer that he sees human scientific endeavor as an exercise in dominating nature or not? Can nature be dominated? Is there something else going on here? And how does that square with his Christianity, with his Protestantism?
If we have a language of final cause, which is the language that Bacon is explicitly rejecting, we have, I think, and guys, I'm being very schematic here, but I think there's something to this. I think we have a necessarily contemplative relationship with the processes of nature. Because in order to understand them, we need to see them unfolding sort of naturally, as it were. What the Hermetic tradition brings is this notion of needing to experiment. And one of the reasons that Bacon becomes so influential is his enthusiasm for experiment. And this is where he talks about nature being sort of squeezed. I think one of the implicit sort of, something implicit in that, and this was certainly sort of part of the culture of this Hermetic tradition, was that nature has secrets. And he says this, he says it's God's role to make for hiddenness and the king's role for, anyway, he quotes this to discover, like this sort of implicit assumption there is that nature contains within it a kind of hiddenness, hidden powers, and that it doesn't offer its hidden powers up to us through contemplation. It offers its hidden powers up to us through experimentation, manipulation, and transformation. And so Bacon, I think that tradition is the one that Bacon is drawing on when but again, he's drawing on it, but is wanting to make it explicit and public, right? Sort of a kind of public knowledge. Just another aspect of Bacon that's so terrifically significant. So that we can, that is now made available, that exploration of the hiddenness of nature is made available to a kind of public, open enterprise that is ultimately, you know, designed for human thriving. Yeah. So that's where that language of hidden, of flexing and dominating comes in. Yeah. It's in order to get nature to tell us her secrets.
But it's not simply a matter of, I mean, there's an element in that question implied that humans have this sort of superpower that they can simply exert on nature. But much of his text seems to imply a skepticism of that there's a midpoint between us being, I mean, he talks about the naked hand on its own cannot discover things. That's what the old logicians like Aristotle and such used to argue. Now it's we need tools and methods with which to sort of temper the flaws of the mind.
Absolutely.
Which is part of his aim with the scientific.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I think the method there you see where he, I mean, he's actually very quite interesting about this in a lot of ways, but it's not just, he seems to be quite liberal about what he wants to include in the scientific method, really, in some ways. So instruments, of course, mathematics, he says, might be useful, maybe not. Like but Daniel, absolutely, it's not a superhuman power at all. In fact, that's what he wants to reject in the magical tradition, is precisely that. He wants to say if method, so our superpower for Bacon, I think, is a number of things. One is it's this method of induction which renders these discoveries of fact, right, open and available to anyone else. So he sees it essentially as not just a communal endeavor between various people working, but a communal endeavor historically as well, right? So the advantage that he sees in the inductive method is that what you can establish through these tables, through this inductive method of examination, of exploration, right? When you've established something as a fact, whether it be by observation or experiment or whatever it is, then that fact will stand, right? Now, the significance of that fact, how it might be used, all of that sort of thing, in a way that then becomes the next step you might want to take. But that can be taken up by someone else in another place, in another country, in another time. But to his mind, with great advantage of that, is that unlike in his sort of account of the schoolmen, as he calls them, the axioms, right, which he takes to have become kind of empty. In this way, he's building up to the axioms, which means that at any step along the way, he might be able to sort of revisit something, re-examine something, right? Something like this. So to his mind, what this means is that the superpower is precisely in this communal aspect of it, and in this explicitly sort of instrumental and public way that the thinking is happening, as it were, sort of outside us on the page. Yeah.
Now, it seems, following on that point, that so the key, I think one of the key things with this induction and deduction kind of thing is, in a lot of the classical texts that we came across, and with people like Scotus, the emphasis was on sort of ideas. And even with, as you say, with Aristotle, he takes an inductive method, but he's leading towards these sort of what you call like the telos kind of thing. Yeah. But with people like Ockham and more so sort of cementing an idea which we're probably more familiar with Bacon, is instead of seeing the world in terms of purified ideas, it's more seeing the world as sort of natural things which can be discovered through experiment bit by bit. And so it's kind of, firstly, does that seem like a fair sort of explanation? It's sort of we're seeing here a rejection of thinking of the world in terms of like the intellect, and more in terms of nature as a physical thing, as matter to be, and that's how we discover it. And secondly, what does that suggest in terms of man's ascendancy? Wouldn't that suggest that man has to cooperate with nature in a different sense, and it's less about his discovery, is less about him thinking up ideas as him having to engage with these tools to discover what nature actually is, as a separate thing of matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, is it Weber? I think Max Weber calls this the disenchantment of the world. I'll try to answer your question in a sec. I think in a way, Bacon's heyday, the great ascendancy of Francis Bacon, was the 19th century. The 19th century is, I think that's where Bacon really gets taken up and celebrated in a way. He's not a very good scientist, all right? That also needs to be said. He didn't really do any scientific work of any note at all. And in fact, he died because he caught pneumonia trying to freeze a turkey, so I think that his actual contribution to science is, his hope was to contribute to sort of in a substantial and concrete way, in the sort of scientific way. He doesn't really do that at all. That's an aside. I'm inclined to think that now we are less smitten by this sense of this sort of domination over nature. Like that this seems to actually have been a catastrophically bad idea to us, right? So those are a couple of things. But back to your question. I think that there is in this, this is why I sort of talked about the work of talking a little bit about his sense of the idols of the various idols and fantasies that we're subject to. To my mind, so interesting to compare this account to, say, Aristotle's account in the Metaphysics. Or, Dante, it's there. Certainly in you guys read the Republic, that this notion that there's a kind of correspondence available to us between the object of our knowledge and the way that we think, right? That in concert together, those give us a kind of scientific understanding of the nature of reality, right? That there's an ascent there through the self and through the world, sort of what happens to Dante, right? That ascent. This has been rendered much more problematic in Bacon. And I think more generally, I think you can see it in Elizabethan England. In a way, this is Hamlet's problem. Marlowe investigate. I think one of my favorite treatments of this is Marlowe in Dr. Faustus, which is this problem of trying to sort of interpret signs. They've become very unstable, right? So this idea of being able to ascend through our senses to the intelligible, right? As you say, these ideas that you get, or for there to have any sort of truck and trade there, right, for that movement to be possible, is rendered very problematic. And it's rendered problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. One is that the signs themselves, which is to say the things that are in nature, like the sun and clouds and whatever is there, all that stuff no longer offers up what it is to us just by its being, right? Like we actually have to like take the cloud and put it in a chamber and pump stuff into it and to figure out what it is. So already there's a kind of estrangement there. And also that our minds are precisely in a way the problem, right? That there's sort of this corruption in thinking that needs to be eliminated, right? Disciplined away. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there's now it's not a done deal. I mean, that's important to say, right? Like induction and empiricism have all kinds of profound philosophical problems with them. Like they're not, and more than that, I mean, Bacon's account of them is, I think, at the level of propaganda is very powerful. It does actually open this sort of form of exploration, which becomes extraordinarily productive, but it's not productive in the way that he imagined. So what's very interesting is you get a kind of account of what's going on. Look, the great triumphs of empiricism many of them don't really look like Bacon at all, right? Newton, he's not doing Baconian science, it would seem, in the Principia anyway. That, I don't know if you ever looked at Newton's Principia. It doesn't look like anything like what Bacon's proposing at all, right? So we needn't take his account of what's going on too seriously in terms of what it reveals about the nature of empiricism or how the natural world can be revealed to us or any of those sorts of things. It obviously extraordinarily powerful though, historically speaking. Look, I mean, to that end, sorry, I'm just cruising on here. Like one of the things I find most amazing about the New Atlantis, okay, so the New Atlantis, clearly a kind of fable, a kind of strange, it's almost dreamlike, all of these things. It becomes taken up by the Royal Society as a kind of plan. So the Royal Society, which is formed, what, 1660, something like that, actually takes the New Atlantis and particularly King Solomon's house there at the end, and they're like, yeah, that's right, that's what we should do. And then they go around building the architecture around it. So it's this extraordinary, everyone's like, wow, it's so prophetic. I'm like, well, yeah, it's prophetic because they put a lot of work in there, right? Like, so it becomes architectural in a really, really fascinating, strange way, the way this narrative gets sort of taken up historically and becomes very, this is how the Royal Society organizes itself. I mean, there's other influences, obviously, but that's a big one, yeah.
I wonder if I could just follow on from what Danielle and I just asked you, just before we go to some of the questions in the chat. Because this theme of trying to dominate nature or submitting to nature in order to dominate it, but okay, that it's nuanced. But there seems to be this idea that there's an optimism in Bacon, I think. This idea that we can somehow get a grip on nature and use that to humanity's benefit.
Absolutely.
But then in the 20th century, we get C.S. Lewis writing The Abolition of Man, in which he argues that mankind's quest to dominate nature has actually led to our simply using nature as a tool to oppress one another and dominate one another, and thereby we actually end up ironically becoming more enslaved. So I wonder whether you think perhaps Bacon was a little bit too optimistic.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking as I was reading the New Atlantis, I was like thinking, wow, the Manhattan Project, Bacon is a perfect example of Baconian science. I mean, it's got everything you'd want, right? You have it's almost that he's described it, right? You've got your you've got your theoreticians, and you've got the people working, you know, making the instruments, and they're all working together, and this person's doing that, and this person, they've got a problem that comes up and they solve it. It's directed. He always says, you know, so important for Bacon that you should be asking directed questions, right? Like, this is very important. So that certainly animated the Manhattan Project. Yeah, so this may be a kind of really great triumph of Baconian science. You don't want to blame it all on Francis Bacon, but I think it seems to be unfair. Yeah, it'd be a little unfair. I mean, he's, you know, he's got big shoulders, but that seems like a lot. I think isn't how successful he was in describing and determining what empiricism and induction and the scientific method were going to be. Because in many ways he's, you know, he contributes to that, but that's a complex, but in some ways quite a limited contribution in some ways. I think, to my mind, what's so striking about Bacon is this pressing together of a kind of pragmatic methodology, an open-ended methodology. I mean, I think that's terrifically important. That is to say, it's self-consciously a methodology. He's trying to create a kind of method but it's a method of discovery. And so it's explicitly sort of self-consciously open-ended. And he actually says, you know, we might never come to an end, right? So in that way, it doesn't contain within itself any sort of limit, if I can put it that way. It's an open-ended methodology. I mean, and when you read his own tables, right? Those are book 2 of the New Organon. They're very simple. Like his experiments are delightful. They're like experiments my 6-year-old does. My 6-year-old loves doing science experiments. Bacon was doing the same kind. He's like, what if I freeze water in a glass jar? What if I freeze water in a metal jar? What's the difference? Like, it's very like that, right? Like, could he have could he have imagined like getting to the bottom of heat was going to take hundreds of years? I mean, could he have imagined like splitting an atom? Like, it seems to me that that open-endedness of Bacon's project is in a way, its power, but in another way, it almost disappears in the amount of information and the sort of energy that goes into exploring the natural world following him. So what seems to me so powerful, Bacon, is this methodology, right? This method, which is very loose, very underdeveloped, underdetermined in some way. Like it's very open-ended. That paired with a kind of a prophetic drive, a kind of promise of peace, of prosperity. This is the promise of the New Atlantis, right? Of peace, prosperity, no more hunger, no more sickness. Those two things coupled together, I think, have been extraordinarily powerful.
How much do you think, Professor, if you think about Dostoevsky's commentary on the kind of the emergence of the secular from, sorry, just admitting somebody, the emergence of the secular from the kind of breakdown of the medieval. And then you're seeing what we're about to witness is the emergence of the modern West, which is both, and we haven't even touched on Bacon's political theory, but his scientific method. We're talking about the emergence of a view that actually will, and we're living in it, dominate the whole world.
Yeah.
Like there's nowhere that we can't exploit or shouldn't exploit. How much is this? What I was struck with the New Atlantis is how driven it was by a kind of evangelical vision.
Yeah.
Right? It's like all the power of the gospel to convert the world was now converted into this secular vision of science and politics that was going to usher in the new kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an extraordinary melding together of two things. I mean, it's, you don't want to speak too broadly in some ways, but it does seem to me to be very significant that the early years of empiricism were so fueled by this evangelical furnace, right? If I can put it that way. I mean, I think sometimes the New Atlantis is read as a yeah. Okay, maybe I can put it this way. I think what's interesting about Bacon, in a weird way, I was sort of formulating for the first time, he was wrong about science in lots of ways, right? But he was not wrong, it would seem, at least maybe until quite recently, about the power of the story that science would provide us with everything we needed would have. Like, it seems that he's right in a really striking way about that. And when I say he was wrong about science, I mean, like, the forces and forms that that have gone into creating, obviously, the sort of modern scientific world are extraordinarily diverse and strange, and much of them would be unrecognizable to Bacon completely. So they're not, he hasn't fueled them in this way. Like, this isn't a kind of simple intellectual event that has created this condition. There's all kinds of things going on. But maybe I can put it this way a bit more clearly. What I think is so interesting with Bacon is that we can see right in its sort of nebulous state how deeply woven in to our sort of dream of science is a older dream about being with God. Right? So, and that seems to me has just become what, I mean, these are all very vague things in a way and schematic, but that gets, in a sense, I think with Bacon, you can see it quite clearly, it gets kind of like worked into the foundation. And so then later, I mean, when you get to David Hume or something like that, like, we can forget the sort of prophetic impulse here, or the evangelical impulse completely, and just sort of, well, God, maybe that, that's hard to prove, right? Given induction and all that sort of stuff like that, just, it sort of drops away. I guess for me, it's a real question. How much is it still implicit, and how much has it truly just been sort of pared away? I think it's implicit, I have to say. I think it's implicit.
Can I follow up on that and ask about, there's a lot there about his emphasis on the material, an emphasis on science and things like that. but he also has, I mean, he spent a fair amount talking about, where he prays to God, for example, within the text for things. What place? Because he also rejects the forms, Plato's forms, ideas, and things like that.
Yeah.
What place, if there is a place, does the immaterial have in Bacon's work?
Yeah, great question.
And and given his placement of God, if it's not an immaterial sense of the divine, what is his sense of the divine?
Well, I mean, the short answer, Daniel, is I don't know what his sense of the divine is. I should probably read a book or two about that. I'm sure there's more to know than I do. I mean, in a way, there's two different questions there. One is about his sense of what the immaterial is, and one is a question about what the divine is. I mean, I think he would say that I don't think Newton, I mean, we're going to see, unlike Descartes, who actually does sort of try to think through what the material is, what matter is. Bacon doesn't have an account of what matter is, precisely because that's the sort of thing that you can only know. I mean, that's an axiom that, I mean, in his own account, he may never reach the end of that question, right? That's matter is something that is what he might call, the way that we use that word is what he calls an idol of the marketplace, right? That the way that we assume that the word points to a particular thing, signifies a particular thing. I think he might have trouble with matter. Hobbes, who's one of his followers, certainly did. Hobbes poured scorn on the question. So I think a kind of skepticism, or I wouldn't be skepticism so much as he would say, I guess he would discipline himself to not having a kind of positive account of what matter is. And likewise, a positive account of any of sort of things that were real that weren't material, I guess. But the divine, I think, is a different question. I mean, and I think the question here is, I think the question here is about the nature of the relationship of nature to the divine, right? And I think that's where his account is quite different, certainly, than ones that you would have been sort of working through in this year. Nature is a thing to be discovered, I think, for Bacon. But the divine is established, as it were, sort of vertically. I think he's quite Protestant in the sense that his relationship with the divine is established sort of vertically, without reference to nature at all, I think. So then so nature becomes the occasion. I mean, nature then becomes the place, the natural world then becomes the place where we live according to Christian principles. I put it something like that, but it wouldn't, yeah. Anyway, Father, go ahead.
Just realizing that we only have 14 minutes left. Father Plant has brought up the question, and this might be a good segue from what you're talking about into next week, the position of this with Descartes.
Yeah.
And, all of a sudden we seem to have, where maybe I'm being too naive, but up until the vision of Dante, you kind of have this vision of integration of the human soul with whatever creation is. But all of a sudden, Father Plant brings up, we have this idea of nature being in opposition to whatever the human person is. Is it a coincidence that Bacon is a contemporary of Descartes?
No, not at all.
Father Plant, do you want to add anything to that?
No, you've just asked exactly what I wrote. Thank you.
I think
Just where does it come from, I suppose? Where does this differentiation come from? The common root, that's all.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
So yeah, having said no, I don't want to add anything. I now am. So, where does the commonality in their division of nature and between nature and humanity, or if you like, the extraction of humanity from nature, come from? I mean, obviously Descartes is famous for dualism, isn't he? You know, but where do you see the origin of this idea of nature and us as something separate from it coming from, please?
Well, I mean, I'd say there's two things going on. I mean, sorry, this isn't going to answer your question immediately, but I think, so the way in which that's absolutely true, I think that there's a kind of, that is in both Bacon and Descartes, in different, I mean, it's sort of inflected in different ways, and its architecture is different, but there's a kind of separation there of man from nature. Absolutely. And it is even an estrangement. But it's also the case, isn't it, that there's a coming together in a striking way of man and nature, which is to say, I mean, one of the things that's striking about both of them in a way, very differently, is for Bacon, nature is immediately available to us to human ends. Right? That the natural world is immediately available and to us for our human ends. He says, like, we won't talk about telos, we won't talk about purposefulness, because the only ends that matter are human ends in this regard. So absolutely, there's a kind of separating out. There's also a nature is made, I mean, this becomes much more, this becomes sort of very much made sort of more explicitly political, if I can put it that way, in Locke. But it's this real way in which nature is made immediately available to us for human ends. And that we should understand it as such. Right, like that is actually our appropriate relationship to the natural world. So in that way, it's not an estrangement at all. Like it's very closely bound together. But I mean, my reading of Bacon is that he doesn't understand this as an estrangement, that he understands that it's a, that what has been made available to us or what ought to be made, or might be made available to us in the inductive method is a return to a kind of oneness with nature, like an Edenic, right? Descartes is Descartes a different problem, boy, in terms of that separation. Yeah, Descartes an entirely different problem, I would say. Partly because I think for Descartes, the thinking has become sort of the rational, his account of rationality has become so immediate and profound that it in a way constitutes the world, in a way that it doesn't for Bacon, in the sense that he's much more instrumentalist and historical and communal in his approach to the creation of certain knowledge. Yeah, so there's a communal aspect that works in Bacon and a historical aspect that is not available to Descartes. So in a weird way, Descartes' estrangement has a different nature. Why? Oh, goodness sakes, I don't know. That's a fascinating question. I'll think about that with Descartes, I think, if that's, yeah, how that comes to be in Descartes? I think it would be a fascinating question for people to think about. Yeah. Yeah.
Just for the last few minutes, what is the difference between this and olive oil? Like, what's the difference between Bacon's vision of harnessing the world towards the human end that wasn't present already in the Greeks when they made olive oil, right? Like they look at something in nature and they say, I want olive oil. I'm going to press the olives. Like, isn't this just the same thing?
Yeah, it could. I mean, look, I think he loved, look, I mean, he says this. Look, he says, look, this is a silly answer to your question, but he says, unlike the crafts, right? Unlike making olive oil, the sciences have become sterile, blah, 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 blah. So I think he sees in craft knowledge, making olive oil, I mean, making instruments, making the Marinel's needle, he loves that, like new shit, all this stuff. He loves this stuff. He's like, look, that's what productive knowledge looks like, not like that, right? That's not your deep question, though. That's just a silly answer to your question. I mean, Father, this isn't really an answer either, but in a way, look, when you look at the Baconian method in its non-revolutionary aspect, when you just look at what he's proposing, not as a kind of dismantling of the Aristotelian logic, which is like all of this stuff that he says, not in that way, but if you look at it, the form he gives, I think it probably looks a lot like what olive oil farmers have been doing for a long time. Yeah. And I don't think he'd find that troubling. You know, this is why I say when Bacon really hits his sort of, his apotheosis, his great moment in the 19th century. I mean, what you start to see in the 19th century is the thought like, oh, let's render everything sort of according to these principles of scientific methodology. So let's do that, let's make chairs that way. Let's do this that way. Let's do that way, right? Well, this is where this idea that the whole of sort of society should sort of follow these rational processes. I don't put it in quotes because it's not rational. I just put it in quotes because there's rational is it means different things. Like there's different ways of talking about it. So this is Baconian rational principles, right? Like, I mean, that really sort of takes hold in the 19th century, yeah. In things like olive making. And in things like, frankly, look, this country that I love and live in, like, it's like the great Baconian country, right? People just went out and started listing stuff. Like, where are these, where's the, how quickly do the rivers run? What are the temperatures here? Can we grow grain at these times? Like the whole country was just like submitted to like, it's like the House of Solomon like came to Canada and like, went around. Yeah. So
yeah, I thought the same thing when I read it. Anyway, we have 4 minutes left. Just enough time to say thank you so much, Professor. Great segue. Can't wait for Descartes.
Well, I hope you guys have a great time with Descartes. Yes. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. It was lovely for me to revisit Bacon. I'd forgotten how profoundly weird he was. And I'm delighted. I am deeply delighted that the father of empiricism was just a nut job and so very, very, very strange. It gives me a strange sense of hope, I have to say. All right. Thank you so much, you guys.